Today's video has plenty of the most bizarre stuff for every possible taste. Evil gods, insane heroes, and weird freaking monsters. Parents eating their children, and children castrating their parents. Rebellion in heaven, and escape from hell. But also plenty of romantic love and dirty hanky-panky, including incest, infidelity, and bestiality. Welcome to this mega compilation of our series on Greek mythology. Our story starts at the very beginning of everything, the origin of the cosmos according to ancient Greek tradition, the Cosmogony. Like Ian Malcolm said in Jurassic Park, everything is chaos. And by chaos, we mean a void. An infinite void was all that existed in the beginning of time. But, all of a sudden, something emerged out of that void. It was the goddess Gaia, the personification of Earth. And she didn't come alone, because the chaos also spawned Eros, the god of desire, and hence eroticism. That desire was very important, since it was an essential element to start up the cosmic machinery and kick off everything that was soon to come. Eros represents the desire, the will to do things. And that's exactly what Gaia did, giving birth to Uranus, who surrounded Gaia and became the sky. After creating the heavens above, it was the turn of the underworld down below, the Tartarus. And just as Gaia had Uranus, the Tartarus had Erebus, or darkness. Then, the last primeval gods to spring from chaos were the goddess Nyx, night, Hemera, day, and Aether, basically air. Nyx in turn produced a whole bunch of gods related to feelings, while other gods to be spawned by Gaia were Typhon, the storms, Pontus, the seas, and Aurea, the mountains. These first primordial gods gave birth to the second generation of gods. Gaia and Uranus had many children, including the Titans, Oceanus, Hyperion, Coeus, Crius, Iapetus, and Cronus, and Titanides, Tethys, Theia, Phoebe, Themis, Mnemosyne, and Rhea. They also had other offspring, like the three Cyclopes, who were one-eyed giants, and then the last three were the Hecatoncheires, creatures with 100 arms and 50 heads. But it seems that Uranus wasn't really into children, and he confined them all to the Tartarus, in Gaia's entrails. This pissed off Gaia, and she urged all the Titans to rebel against their father. But only one of them had the balls to do something about it, Cronus. Okay, we need to make a quick pause here because there is often some confusion with this name. The Cronus we're referring to here was a Titan, son of Uranus and later father of Zeus and many members of the first generation of Olympic gods, not to be mistaken with Kronos, the Greek personification of time. This confusion is largely due to the fact that they both have several possible spellings and many of them are exactly the same. But in general, the time deity is Kronos, Chronos, whereas the Titan we're referring to is Cronus, Cronus. In addition, Kronos the Titan is usually depicted with a scythe or sickle that his mother, Gaia, gave him when she urged him to free his siblings from their tyrannical father, Uranus. That scythe symbolizes his condition as primordial god of agriculture and bringer of wealth. It has nothing to do with death and the passage of time. Got that? Yes? Okay, let's continue then. As we were saying, Cronus was the only Titan with the balls to rebel against his father. And it was all about balls, because one day, while Uranus was giving Gaia a good going over, Cronus crept up on them and castrated him. Uranus's balls went flying off as he spurted blood and semen everywhere. Out of those juices spilt on the earth sprung new gods, like the Erinyes, the three goddesses of vengeance, and also the Gigantes, and the nymphs of the forest, the Meliads, the most important of which was Melia. But not all of Uranus's junk was spilt on Earth. Some of it fell on the ocean, where it formed a foam, which then gave birth to Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, love, and reproduction. After castrating his father, Cronus freed his siblings and banished Uranus. Unfortunately, he proved to be just as tyrannical as his father, locking up the Cyclopes and Hecatoncheires in the Tartarus. Next, he married his sister Rhea, also called Cybele in Phrygia, and this union produced the third generation of gods. But when these new gods were about to come along, Gaia warned Cronus that one of his children would take his place as supreme god, just like he had done with his own father. And so, as the babies were born, Cronus ate them one by one.
Baby, it's what's for dinner!
First was Hestia, goddess of homes and architecture. Then Demeter, goddess of agriculture. Hera, goddess of marriage. Hades, god of the underworld. And Poseidon, god of the seas. However, just as she began to give birth to a sixth child, Zeus, Rhea decided to save him. So she gave Kronos a rock wrapped in a blanket. The trick worked, and Kronos ate the rock, believing it was the last child.
A delicious-looking limestone rock.
Rhea then hid Zeus in the caves of the island of Crete, and there he was raised by the nymphs of the forest and a goat called Amalthea. He was also protected by the Curetes, magical beings who danced around and made loud noises so that Kronos wouldn't hear baby Zeus crying. At this same time, there were many liaisons between the Titans. For example, Oceanus and Tethys got jiggy with it and had plenty of offspring, including the rivers and the Oceanids, the most famous of which were Metis, Asia, Electra, Clymene and Styx. Then Hyperion and Theia produced Eos, the dawn, Helios, the sun, and Selene, the moon. Coeus and Phoebe produced Leto and Asteria. Leto would later get it on with Zeus and give birth to Apollo and Artemis, while her sister Asteria refused to have anything to do with Zeus and turned into an island to avoid him.
Oh, look at that.
For their part, Iapetus and Asia sired Prometheus, Epimetheus, and Atlas, who would later have his own children, including Calypso and various other nymphs like the Pleiades and the Hesperides, protectors of the famous garden of the Hesperides. Meanwhile, with Uranus out of commission, Gaia coupled with Pontus and had Phorthys, Ceto, a monstrous whale, hence the term cetacean, Eurybia, and the so-called sea elders, Nereus, who had 50 daughters known as the Nereids, the nymphs of the sea, and Thaumas, who would marry Electra and produce Iris, goddess of the rainbow, Arche, and the Harpies, horrible winged monster ladies. The union between the Titan Crius and the Pontid Eurybia produced Astreus, god of astrology. Here it's worth mentioning his child, Boreas, god of the northern wind, who was thought to live with his immortal children in the land of Hyperborea, an unexplored territory beyond Thrace. Another pair of siblings who got together were Phorcys and Ceto, producing Scylla, a sea creature, Ladon, a dragon with 100 heads, Thusa, a nymph resembling a mermaid who later coupled with Poseidon to give birth to the Cyclops Polyphemus, the Graia, 3 old crones who shared a single eye and a single tooth, and the Gorgons, creatures so horrible that you would turn to stone if you looked at them. And they may have also produced the mermaids. Their last daughter was Echidna, who married Typhon and birthed some of the most famous monsters in Greek mythology, including the 3-headed dog Cerberus, Orthrus, the Chimera, the Sphinx, the Hydra of Lerna, the Lion of Nemea, the Eagle of Prometheus, the Dragon of Colchis, and the Sow of Chromion. In a future episode, we will see how Hercules killed many of these monsters, only to then get busy with their mother, Echidna, and produce more offspring. Yep, Greek mythology is very misogynistic and can get very freaking weird. During the reign of Cronus, there appeared, apparently created by Prometheus, a race of happy men who did not work, lived of the fruits of the land, and never aged. This was known as the Golden Age of Man, since these first humans were almost like gods, always strong and enjoying carefree lives. It is said that these lucky lot lived in a region of the Peloponnesus called Arcadia, which was basically like a paradise on Earth.
I'm so glad we came to paradise.
But Cronus was still a mean tyrant, so it was just a matter of time until his son Zeus rebelled against him and the other Titans. Once Zeus became older, he managed to trick his father into drinking a potion prepared by Metis, which made him vomit all his siblings, and together they fought a war known as the Titanomachy, the War of the Titans. After 10 years of intense battle, Zeus defeated the Titans on the plains of Thessaly. Then he locked them up in the Tartarus once again and established a new cosmic order. But it seems that this new plan had no place for immortal humans, so Zeus turned them all into daemons, or protective spirits who would serve as guides to the Tartarus for the next race of humans that he then created. This was the Silver Age of Man. In addition, Zeus freed the Hecatoncheires, who then became the jailers of the Titans, and also the Cyclopes, who thanked the gods for their freedom by forging weapons for them. For Zeus, they made thunder and lightning. For Hades, a helmet of darkness that turned him invisible. And for Poseidon, a trident. Meanwhile, Atlas, the leader of the Titans, was condemned to hold the heavens in what is known as the Atlas Range, which runs through northern Morocco and Algeria. The Titanomachy finally brought peace to the world, but alas, it wouldn't last for long. Zeus had to deal with 2 uprisings instigated by his own grandmother Gaia. She was mad about the imprisonment of the Titans, so she set the Gigantes against Zeus and his crew. After some intense battling, the gods beat the Gigantes, and then came the second uprising, headed by Typhon and known as the Typhonomachy. This creature, with 100 fire-breathing dragon and snake heads, was a tough opponent, but Zeus eventually prevailed and cast Typhon into the depths of the Tartarus, sealing the pit with Mount Etna. For the Greeks, this was the reason why it sometimes spewed lava. They didn't know it was a volcano. Now Zeus was finally triumphant and decided to settle his royal court in Mount Olympus, located in Thessaly. From that place in the high heavens, Zeus ruled the world, giving his brother Poseidon power over the seas and Hades over the underworld, the resting place of the dead. Along with them were Hera, Zeus's legitimate wife, Athena, Demeter, Hestia, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Hermes, Aphrodite, and Hephaestus, known as the 12 Olympic gods. And if you're wondering, where did all this lot come from? Well, it turns out that Zeus was a horny dog and spent all his time chasing every female in sight. Officially, his legitimate wife was his sister Hera, goddess of marriage. She was from the region of Arcadia, and Zeus seduced her in the shape of a cuckoo. From this union came Ares, god of war and brute strength, Hebe, goddess of youth, and Eileithyia, goddess of birth, and maybe also Hephaestus, god of forges and metallurgy, but the story of his origin is not entirely clear. But now we have to delve into Zeus's extramarital affairs, which were plenty. With Metis, he was going to have a baby, but then an oracle told Zeus to be wary, for one of Metis' children would take his throne. So then Zeus, seeing that history was going to repeat itself, decided to eat Metis, which was exactly the same thing his father had done in the same situation. Go figure. But then he started to suffer massive headaches, and so Hephaestus, with the best of intentions, split his head with an axe to relieve the pain. I guess it makes sense, kinda.
That is without a doubt the dumbest thing I've ever heard.
Well, next thing you know, out of Zeus's open skull, uttering a battle cry, sprang forth a grown-up Athena, goddess of wisdom, battles, strategy, and civilization, who would soon become his father's favorite daughter. Athena was also the protector of Athens, hence the city's name. Zeus then got in bed with Leto, who gave birth to Apollo, the pretty boy of Olympus, god of the sun, music, and medicine, and who later passed on all that knowledge to his own son, Asclepius. Apollo was born in the island of Delos, and later established the Oracle of Delphos, because he was into divination and soothsaying and all that new age kind of stuff. But first he had to kill the giant snake Python.
I hate snakes, Jacques! I hate them!
Leto also birthed Artemis, goddess of hunting and nature. The Olympic handyman, Hephaestus, was tasked with creating the arrows for the powerful bows of Apollo and Artemis. The fastest god, Hermes, Olympic messenger and patron of commerce, and also of thieves, figures, was born from the union between Zeus and Maia, the eldest of the Pleiades we saw earlier. He also invented the pipes and always carried them with him, along with his staff. One day, he used this staff to separate 2 quarreling snakes, which then coiled onto it, and that was the origin of the caduceus, the symbol of heralds and commerce, not to be mistaken with the staff of Asclepius, the symbol of medicine. Later, Hermes and Aphrodite would have a child together, Hermaphrodite, who had both genders. But we're not yet done with Zeus's affairs, not by a long stretch. He also seduced Demeter, thus siring Persephone, who was later abducted by Hades to be his queen of the underworld. This is important because it originated one of the key rites in Greek religion, the Eleusinian Mysteries, which celebrated the arrival of Persephone from Hades in the spring and her return to the underworld in winter. That is how the ancient Greeks interpreted the cycle of the seasons, in terms of the moods of the goddess of agriculture. And Zeus had many more flings. Like with Themis, the Titanide of justice, resulting in the Horai, the goddesses of seasons, and perhaps also the 3 Moirai, goddesses of destiny. Later, he got in the sack with Mnemosyne, goddess of memory, resulting in the 9 Muses, who represented various aspects of creativity. And not yet happy with all this, Zeus even found time to chase mortal females like Semele, with whom he fathered Dionysus, god of wine, enjoyment and theatre, Alcmene, who would give birth to Heracles, the greatest hero in Greek mythology, and also Danae, siring Perseus, Thalia, siring Palici, Europa, siring Minos, Laodamia, siring Sarpedon, Callisto, siring Arcas, Calliope, siring Corybantes, and the list goes on and on and on. Understandably, Hera was completely fed up with Zeus's shenanigans. She was jealous and vengeful, and with reason. So, one day she decided to have a child all by herself. This was Hephaestus, who was deformed, and so she cast him away from Olympus. In revenge, Hephaestus built her a magnificent golden throne, which his mother was delighted with. But when Hera sat on it, she was stuck. In the end, Dionysus had to intervene. He got Hephaestus drunk and made him free her. Later, they kissed and made up, but since we've mentioned Dionysus, it's worth explaining that Hera normally paid her jealousy with the women that her husband seduced, but other times she would pick on their children. For example, she made the Titans tear apart Dionysus and boil him in a cauldron. Lucky for him, his grandmother Rhea resurrected him, and Zeus then had to hide him away for a while, transforming him into a goat. An unpleasant incident took place when Hera tried to stage a coup together with the other Olympic gods. They tied up Zeus while he was sleeping, but the Hecatoncheires came to his aid and freed him. In revenge for this, Zeus hung Hera from the skies for a very long time, while Apollo and Poseidon were sentenced to hard labor, building the mythical walls of Troy. Inachus, an Oceanid son of Tethys and Oceanus, and first king of Argos, had several children with the nymph Melia, namely Phoroneus, Aegilius, Mycene, and Io. This last daughter also had a fling with Zeus. When Hera found out, she turned Io into a cow and left her with the giant Argus Panoptes, who was a great guardian because he had 100 eyes. Zeus sent Hermes to save her, and he did it by putting the giant to sleep with his music and then killing him. But then Hera found out and sent a horsefly to pester Io the cow, which then ran off, crossing the Bosphorus, meaning Ox Passage, and reaching Egypt, where Zeus found her, turned her back into a human so he could get busy with her, resulting in the birth of Epaphus, who would later become the Egyptian god Apis, while Io herself became Isis. And you're probably thinking, Egyptian gods? What do they have to do with the Greeks? The answer is nothing really, but the Greeks were very syncretistic, and they liked to think about the origin of their neighbors' gods, but always through the lens of their own mythology. For the Greeks, all the gods from other cultures originated from the gods that they themselves worshipped. And since we've veered off topic, we might as well address something that came up after posting the original video in the Spanish channel. In the comments, many of you asked, "Hey, where is Kratos?" in reference to the protagonist of the God of War video game saga. Well, you may be interested to know that, although he has nothing to do with that character, there was indeed a god named Kratos in Greek mythology. He was the son of the Titan Pallas and the Oceanid Styx, and was considered the personification of male strength and power, and he fought on the side of the Olympic gods in both the Gigantomachy and Titanomachy. And now let's return to Mount Olympus. After transforming the Golden Age humans into protective spirits, Zeus created the Silver Age humans, who were nowhere near as cool. In fact, they were mostly treated as outcasts. Lucky for them, they had a powerful friend, the Titan Prometheus, who had been allowed to remain free as a reward for helping Zeus in the battle against the other Titans. But this would prove troublesome, because his number one hobby was messing with Zeus. His first trolling was when Zeus decided that humans should make sacrifices to the gods. Prometheus let him choose first which part of the sacrificial ox he preferred, but he had previously placed all the delicious bits in the animal's entrails, which were disgusting, and wrapped all the inedible parts, like the bones, in the tasty fat. Naturally, Zeus chose the second option, and when he realized he had been tricked by the Titan, he got so mad that he took fire away from the humans in revenge. Prometheus then decided to steal the fire, which was guarded by Hephaestus, and return it to the humans. Of course, they were extremely grateful, but this made Zeus even angrier. As a punishment, he sent among the humans the first woman, Pandora, carrying with her a mysterious box. And when the girl opened that box, all the evils of mankind came out of it. Aging, disease, pain, madness, misery, passions, vices. Only one thing remained at the very bottom of the box: hope, the last thing we lose. This was a pivotal moment for humans, who thus arrived at the third age of mankind, the age of the men of bronze. when we started to exterminate each other in wars driven by our passions and greed. From this point onwards, when human beings died, they were transported to the underworld. After passing away, Hermes, or the forest spirits, guided the soul of the deceased person up to a lake, where they boarded the boat of Charon, the ferryman, who had to be paid for his work, which is why, when the Greeks buried their dead, they placed coins under the tongue or on the eyes of the corpse. And here we have to make another brief pause. Apparently, only the first is correct. The tradition in ancient Greece was to place one coin under the tongue of the deceased person. It seems that the coins on the eyes are more of a Hollywood thing. The reason for the coin was that Charon interrogated the dead souls before ferrying them over to the underworld, and since those souls had no voice, when they opened their mouths to try to answer, the only thing that would come out would be the coin, and so Charon would receive his payment. Now back to our story. The end of the journey was guarded by Cerberus, a monstrous three-headed dog which prevented the living from entering. Once in the underworld, the souls were judged by King Minos, his brother Rhadamanthus, and Aeacus, king of Aegina. This trio decided your eternal fate. If you had been a virtuous man or a great warrior, you would go to the Elysian fields. If you had been an asshole, you were sentenced to the Tartarus. And if you had been just a regular guy, then you went to the Asphodel Meadows. Now let's leave the underworld and return to the surface, where Zeus was so angry with Prometheus that he chained him up in the Caucasus and had an eagle eat his liver during the day only to have it regenerate during the night and remain in an infinite cycle of pain. Meanwhile, Phoroneus, son of the river god Inachus, took over a small village which would later become the city of Argos. He managed to civilize humanity and also taught them how to make fire, which they had lost after the whole Promethean debacle. It is said that Phoroneus was the first to build a city, and that during his reign, Hermes taught humans how to speak in various different tongues. Another son of Inachus was Aegialeus, who founded the city-state of Sicyon. One of his daughters, Niobe, slept with Zeus, and who didn't, and gave birth to Argus and Pelasgus. More on him in a moment. Phoroneus also had Apis, who later ruled Egypt, and Car, who founded the city of Megara. Pandora, the box opener, ended up marrying Epimetheus, brother of Prometheus, and having a girl called Pyrrha, who later married her own cousin, the son of Prometheus and Clymene, Deucalion. Over in the region of Attica, Actaeus became the first king, and his successor, Cecrops, founded the city of Athens. Pelasgus, the child of Zeus and Niobe, ruled Arcadia, and his son, Lycaon, caused a lot of trouble for all humans. After inheriting the throne of Arcadia, he got a bit carried away with his devotion to Zeus, and ended up making human sacrifices and serving their flesh to him. When Zeus found out what Lycaon had done, he punished him by turning him into history's first werewolf, and that is where the term lycanthrope comes from. But things didn't end there, because his 50 children were no better than their father. And eventually, Zeus got so fed up with all their wolf crap that he decided to send a great flood to destroy all the men of the Bronze Age. At that time, Deucalion was visiting his chained father Prometheus, who told him about Zeus's plan. So Deucalion and his wife and cousin Pyrrha built a large wooden chest to save themselves. The flood didn't really end up destroying everything. There were several survivors, but Deucalion and Pyrrha made generous offerings to Zeus, and he forgave them and granted them a wish. They asked for humanity to be restored, and this was done by casting rocks over their heads, which turned into new men and women. This would be the last race of humans, the men of iron, ourselves.
I am Iron Man.
Deucalion and Pyrrha also had several children, Protogonia, Amphictyon, and Helen, from whom the demon in Hellenic is derived, and whose 3 children founded the 3 main Greek tribes, Dorians, Ionians, and Aeolians. While all this was going on, Zeus went back to his exploits. He transformed into a bull to abduct the Phoenician princess Europa, and from this tryst were born King Minos, Rhadamanthus, and Sarpedon. Europa's brother Cadmus looked for her all over Greece, eventually reaching the region of Boeotia, where he founded a fortress that became the city of Thebes. Later, after killing Ares' pet dragon, he was punished, but eventually he was forgiven and married Ares' daughter Harmonia. At this time, things were starting to change, and the gods got gradually less involved in earthly matters. Greece was about to enter the age of heroes. This age began after the great flood which the god Zeus had sent to destroy mankind for being a bunch of selfish idiots. 2 children of the primeval Titans, Deucalion and Pyrrha, managed to survive the flood and repopulate the world. It was then that these epic heroes started popping up all over the place, fruit of liaisons between mortals and the gods, especially Zeus. He was a horny dog. And now that you know the context, let's have a look at some of the world's most legendary heroes. Zeus and the mortal Io had a son called Epaphus. One of his later descendants was Acrisius, king of Argos, who married Eurydice and had a baby girl called Danae. The only problem was that the king wanted a boy, but when he went to consult the oracle about this, he got a very unsettling prediction. He would have a male heir, a grandson by his daughter Danae, but that child would end up killing him. King Acrisius reacted to this news by locking up Danae, but that didn't help, because Zeus had already got his eye on the girl, and one night he came to her in the form of a shower of gold and got her pregnant, which is how she gave birth to our hero Perseus. Some time later, King Acrisius heard the baby crying inside the cell. Furious, he threw Danae and the boy into a wooden chest and cast them into the sea, hoping to be rid of them. But the chest ended up in the net of a fisherman named Dictys, who rescued the mother and child and took them into his family. This Dictys was the brother of Polydectes, king of the island of Seriphos, who took a fancy to Danae, but Perseus was always around to ward him off. Until one day, King Polydectes organized a banquet to announce his marriage to Hippodamia and requested contributions from everyone. All the guests brought lavish gifts except for Perseus, who was poor, and so he was disgraced. But, if nothing else, he was a confident young lad, and since Polydectes appeared to have forgotten about his mother, he promised the king anything in the world that he wanted. The sneaky Polydectes then asked for the head of Medusa, believing that Perseus would die in this mission. But not only did Perseus survive, this quest would write his name into the history books forever. Mind you, Perseus had help from the goddess Athena, who explained to him that Medusa was one of the 3 Gorgons, creatures so horrible that looking into their eyes would turn you to stone. She also gave Perseus a reflecting shield, which he could use to see the monster and avoid her gaze, while Hermes gave him a steel sickle to cut her head. Athena then advised him to gather 3 magic items guarded by the Stygian nymphs. But their location was only known to the Graeae, 3 old sisters who shared a single eye and a single tooth. Perseus managed to find the Graeae, steal that eye, and exchange it for the info he needed. That was how he found the nymphs, from whom he then got a pair of flying sandals, a magic bag to keep the head of Medusa, and Hades' helm, which made him invisible. Once kitted out, Perseus traveled to the land of Hyperborea, where the Gorgons lived, and thanks to all the equipment and the advice that he had gathered, he managed to cut off Medusa's head. Out of her dead body sprung the flying horse Pegasus and the warrior Chrysaor. Perseus then shoved Medusa's head into the bag and managed to escape from the other 2 Gorgons using the sandals and the helm. On the way back home, the Titan Atlas refused to let him stay at the Garden of the Hesperides because a prophecy foretold that the garden would be sacked by a son of Zeus. And this prophecy was correct, as we will see later. Perseus, who didn't take rejection well, pulled out Medusa's head and turned Atlas into rock. According to the legend, this was how the Atlas Range was formed. Later, while flying over Ethiopia, he saw a young girl chained to a cliff. This girl was Princess Andromeda, and she was being offered to appease the sea monster Ceto, which had been sent as a punishment against the kingdom of the girl's mother, Queen Cassiopeia, after she had offended the deities by saying her daughter was the most beautiful girl in the world. Perseus killed the monster and then demanded the hand of Andromeda, but some of her relatives tried to refuse him, so he turned them all to stone. After all this, he finally returned to Seriphos, and there he also turned to stone King Polydectes and his minions, placing his adoptive father Dictys on the throne. Perseus then gifted Medusa's head to Athena for all her help and decided to reconcile with his grandfather, Acrisius, king of Argos. But just as the prophecy had foretold, Perseus did end up killing his granddad, albeit by accident. It happened during a sporting competition, when Perseus threw a discus, with pretty terrible aim it must be said, and hit the king, boom, right on the head.
Oké, ik wens je succes en laten we erin.
Devastated, Perseus refused to take the throne of Argos and instead swapped places with his cousin Megapenthes, who was said to become king of Tiryns. Perseus also founded the city of Mycena and had many children known as the Perseids, one of whom, Perses, went to live in Phoenicia and is thought to have given rise to the Persians. The hero Bellerophon was the son of the king of Corinth. He lived a miserable life after having killed his brother and also being falsely accused of trying to force the wife of Proteus, king of Tyrants. Nobody dared to execute him and risk angering the gods because he was thought to be a son of Poseidon. So instead, he was sent to kill the Chimera, a freaky hybrid monster which would surely eat him for breakfast. On his way, he captured the flying horse Pegasus, and together they managed to riddle the monster with arrows and kill it. Bellerophon was eventually able to prove his innocence and became a popular guy. Unfortunately, the fame went to his head, and he decided to fly up to Mount Olympus with Pegasus. Zeus didn't like this cockiness, so he knocked Bellerophon down, and that was the end of him. But Pegasus did manage to reach the skies and became a lovely constellation. How nice. The god Poseidon, just like his brother Zeus, also had a few extramarital affairs. His most famous relationship was with Aethra, wife of King Aegeus of Athens, which resulted in the birth of Theseus. The boy grew up in Trojan, far from the royal court, until he turned 16 and his mother told him the truth about his origin.
I want the truth!
Upon learning about his lineage, Theseus lifted a rock where his father had hidden a royal sword and sandals and made his way to Athens to be recognized as the king's son. On the way there, he defeated Periphetes, the club bearer, and took his staff. He also killed other evil characters like Charon, who kicked travelers into the sea to be devoured by a turtle, and also Thersion, king of Eleusis. Eventually, Theseus reached Athens, where his dad's consort, the sorceress Medea, tried to get rid of him so he wouldn't take the throne from her own child. She got the king to set Theseus the task of capturing the infamous bull of Marathon, which he accomplished. Aegeus then recognized him as his own legitimate son and kicked Medea out of the kingdom.
Go away! I never want to see you again!
At that time, Athens had a big problem. King Minos, who every 9 years demanded a tribute of 14 youngsters to be devoured by the Minotaur. Okay, here we're gonna do a quick interlude to explain how things got to this point. As we saw in the previous episode, Zeus, in the shape of a white bull, abducted a Phoenician princess called Europa and took her to the island of Crete. It is thought that the name Europa means sunset or place where the sun sets, and that it later acquired the meaning of the western or occidental lands, hence the name of the continent. After having 3 children with Europa, Rhadamanthus, Sarpedon and Minos, Zeus abandoned her in Crete. The king of the island, Asterion, took in Europa and adopted her children, and eventually left the throne to Minos. As with almost every element in mythology, there is a bit of controversy here. Some people believe that there were 2 Minos. This was the good one, and the other one, his grandson, was a rotten apple. Others believe that they are one and the same. In any case, for his coronation, Minos asked Poseidon for a bull to sacrifice it in his honor, and then lo and behold, a bull came out of the sea. But it was such an amazing bull that Minos decided to hide it and sacrifice another one instead. Poseidon realized this, he was a god after all, and punished Minos in a typical Greek mythology freaky way. He made his wife Pasiphae fall madly in love with the bull, to the point that she got busy with it. Ugh, how? And the result of this zoophilic relationship was the Minotaur. When Minos found out what had happened, he flipped out and decided to hide away the mutant monster in a giant labyrinth designed by Daedalus, his genius architect. Things went relatively well for a while, until one day Minos' son Androgeus won an athletic competition, and the jealous king of Athens, Aegeus, challenged him to kill the bull of Marathon. This ended with the kid dying, although it's not entirely clear if he was killed by the bull or was assassinated. Either way, Minos was furious. He invaded the region of Attica and imposed the tribute we mentioned. 7 boys and 7 girls every 9 years who would be thrown into the labyrinth to be devoured by the Minotaur. This is how things stood for many years until our brave hero Theseus came into the story. After being recognized by his father Aegeus, Theseus decided to kill the Minotaur. He volunteered as one of the tributes and traveled to Crete. When he got to the royal palace of Knossos, he met one of Minos' daughters, Ariadne, who fell in love with the handsome lad and asked Theseus to take her away with him. To help him in his quest of killing the Minotaur, she slipped Theseus a ball of thread and a sword. Theseus then tied one end of the thread to the entrance and went to the monster's encounter. After finding it and having a big smackdown, Theseus killed the Minotaur and then managed to make his way back following the thread. He picked up Ariadne and the other tributes and they all fled the island. Sounds like a perfect ending, doesn't it? The hero Theseus had killed the ugly monster, rescued the girl and the other kids, and was now on his way back home to Athens. Well, here comes the screw-up. Theseus' father, King Aegeus, had been extremely worried for his son, so before he left for Crete, he had asked him to put up white sails on his boat when he returned, to let him know that everything had gone well. But on the journey back, Theseus had too much on his mind and forgot about this. So when King Aegeus saw the black sails on the boat, he thought his son had died and killed himself, jumping into the sea from a high cliff. This act of royal stupidity gave origin to the name of the Aegean Sea, and also made Theseus the new king of Athens. Meanwhile, back in Crete, King Minos was mad at Daedalus for giving Ariadne the ball of thread, so he locked him up in his own labyrinth, or in a tower, according to other versions of the myth. Wherever it was, Daedalus and his son Icarus managed to escape thanks to some wings he invented, but Icarus got carried away and flew too close to the sun. This melted the wax that held the wings together, and Icarus plummeted to his death. The story says that after escaping, Daedalus found refuge at the court of King Cocalus in Sicily. But when King Minos found out that he had escaped, he determined to kill Daedalus, and went looking for him all over the Mediterranean, asking every king he encountered the riddle of how to run a thread through a spiral seashell. King Cocalus asked Daedalus to solve it, which he did by tying the thread to an ant. But when he saw the threaded seashell, Minos knew for sure that Daedalus was being protected by Cocalus, and demanded his return. The Sicilian king said, "Sure, my friend, but before that, have a nice bath." And then his daughters boiled Minos alive. Meanwhile, after going through all the labyrinth business, Theseus abandoned Ariadne at the island of Naxos. But lucky for her, on the island she met Dionysus, with whom she enjoyed a few pretty crazy nights. I mean, he was the god of wine and parties. Together they sired Enopion, the personification of wine, who later became king of Chios. Orion, another son of Poseidon, this time with the Gorgon Euryale, fell in love with Enopion's daughter, Merope, and one day he drunkenly assaulted her. This was a bad idea. Enopion tore out his eyes and kicked him out of Chios. But the god Helios took pity and cured him. Whereupon Orion, as a sign of gratitude, decided to hunt every single animal in the world. This angered the primeval goddess Gaia, who had created all of those animals. So she sent a giant scorpion to kill him. But somehow both Orion and the scorpion ended up as constellations. Finally, poor Ariadne didn't end her days very happily. She was killed by Perseus, but it's not very clear why. Laius was king of Thebes, and with his wife Jocasta they had a boy called Oedipus, but an oracle had foretold the king the usual Greek prophecy, that his son would eventually kill him. So Laius messed up the child's feet and then abandoned him in the mountains, hoping he would die. Of course, the boy didn't die. He was rescued by a shepherd and ended up being raised by the king of Corinth. Several years later, an oracle told Oedipus that he would one day kill his father and marry his own mother. Oedipus, who didn't know that he was adopted, freaked out and ran away from Corinth. On the road, he came across King Laius, his real father.
I am your father.
With whom he got into an argument and then a fight which ended in Oedipus killing Laius. At that time, Thebes was being tormented by the Sphinx, a monster sent by Zeus's wife, the goddess Hera, which posed riddles and killed those who couldn't solve them. Oedipus went to try his luck and managed to solve the riddle and kill the monster. He then became king of Thebes and married his real mother Jocasta, thus fulfilling the prophecy. Years later, Jocasta discovered that Oedipus was the one who had killed Laius and worked out the whole twisted story. Deranged, she hung herself, while Oedipus tore out his own eyes and fled Thebes, cursing the children, or brothers, he had had with Jocasta. But the tragic story doesn't end there. It continues with two of those cursed children, Polynices and Eteocles. They were taking turns as kings of Thebes until Eteocles got greedy and decided to kick out his brother and keep the throne to himself. Polynices sought support to fight his brother in other cities, and the king of Argos, Adrastos, helped him by recruiting 7 paladins who tried to conquer Thebes. These were known as the 7 against Thebes. After a long siege, the 7 were beaten back, and the 2 quarreling brothers ended up killing each other. If you ask me, they should have done it straight away and saved everyone a lot of trouble. Anyway, the action wasn't over yet. 10 years later, the children of those 7 heroes sought revenge against Thebes. This was the War of the Epigods. Cosmogony, and this time round Thebes was conquered. Without any doubt, the most famous Greek hero was Heracles, later known as Hercules by the Romans, but initially named Alcides. According to the legend, he was born in Thebes, but considered Argos as his second home since that was where his family came from. While the king of Tyrants was away, Zeus slept with his wife Alcmene, and this produced the demigod Alcides. To make the boy immortal, Zeus placed him on Hera's bosom while she was asleep, so that he would drink the magic milk from her heavenly breast. But Hera woke up with a start, and the milk was spilled all over, forming the Milky Way. Maybe that's why Hera never liked Heracles, and she was the worst possible enemy to have. On one occasion, she slipped 2 snakes into the baby's cradle, but he was already a tough nut and killed them with his bare hands. When he turned 18, King Theseus asked him to get rid of the pesky Lion of Cythereon, and in reward, the king let Heracles sleep with a different one of his 50 daughters every night. They all became pregnant, and these children were known as the 50 Thespiades.
Boom, 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 boom.
Later, Heracles married the daughter of King Creon of Thebes, Megara.
My friends call me Meg.
But Hera was still bent on ruining his life, so she made him go insane and kill his wife, his own children, and the children of his half-brother Iphiclus. When he recovered, seeking to atone for his sins, he traveled to the Oracle of Delphos and changed his name to Heracles, in honor of Hera. Then he had to place himself at the service of King Eurystheus of Tyrants and complete a series of labors to gain a heavenly pardon and become immortal. The missions he had to accomplish were the following.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
First, hunt down another lion, the Lion of Nemea. He did this and then used the animal's pelt to make his mythical armor. Next, kill the Hydra of Lerna and its giant crab friend. He did this with the help of his nephew Iolaus, who burned the necks of the monster to prevent it regrowing its heads. For his third task, he captured the golden hind of Cerynea in the northern land of Hyperborea. After that, he had to overcome the centaurs in order to hunt the Erymanthean boar. Then he cleaned the filthy stables of King Augeas by changing the course of 2 rivers. The next task was to drive away a plague of pesky birds from Lake Stymphalos. Heracles accomplished this using a magic clapper that the goddess Athena had given him. His 7th labor was to capture the bull of Crete, the very same one that Pasiphae, wife of King Minos, had fallen in love with and had sired the Minotaur. This gigantic bull was wreaking havoc, but Heracles managed to wrestle it down and take it to Mycenae. This was considered as mission accomplished, even though later the bull was freed and ended up in Attica, where it killed the son of Minos and caused the invasion of Athens and the rest of the story we saw earlier. The tributes to the Minotaur, Theseus and all that. Incidentally, this is supposed to be the same bull that Theseus killed at Marathon in order to be recognized by his father. Returning to Heracles, he traveled to Thrace and brought back the mares of the giant Diomedes, which he had trained to eat human flesh. This turned out to be a mistake by Diomedes, as he ended up being eaten by them. The next challenge was to steal the girdle of Hippolyta, queen of the Amazons of Themyscira, and for this mission, Heracles was accompanied by Theseus. The girdle was a present from the god Ares, because Hippolyta was his own daughter. It seems that the queen liked the strapping young Hercules and was quite prepared to just give him the girdle, along with the rest of her clothes, but before she could do that, the goddess Hera turned into an Amazon and began to spread the rumor that Heracles had kidnapped Hippolyta. The Amazons were furious and all hell broke loose. In the ensuing battle, Heracles ended up killing Hippolyta and taking her girdle. But just to make things a bit more confusing, Theseus did kidnap one of the Amazons, Hippolyta's sister Antiope, although he later abandoned her to marry Phaedra, the sister of Ariadne, the other girl he had abandoned. Antiope did not take this rejection well. She gathered the Amazons and attacked Athens to stop the wedding. But the Athenians defeated them, and that was the end of it. But we're not yet done with Heracles' tasks. The last 3 were the most dangerous and complicated. The 10th was stealing the cattle of the giant Geryon in Erythea, which may have been the lovely Spanish city of Cádiz. As he was sailing there, he found his way blocked by rocks, so he used his super strength to push them apart, thus creating the Straits of Gibraltar, marked by the famous Pillars of Hercules. Geryon was a 3-bodied giant, the strongest guy in the world, and his cattle was guarded by Eurytion, son of Ares, and his 2-headed dog Orthrus. But none of this made much difference to Hercules, who killed them all with poisoned arrows, loaded the herd into his boat, and made his way back home. The 11th task was to steal the golden apples which conferred immortality from the garden of the Hesperides, which was protected by those nymphs and the dragon Ladon. Heracles began by freeing the Titan Prometheus from his eternal torture, who then advised him not to take the apples from the tree with his own bare hands, leaving it instead to his own brother, the Titan Atlas, as he would know where to find the garden and would also be trusted by the Hesperides. Heracles followed this advice, found Atlas and offered him a deal. He would take the Titan's place holding up the skies as long as Atlas promised to obtain the apples and take them to Mycenae to fulfill the task. Of course, Atlas accepted straight away, but Heracles was a conman. When Atlas returned to show him the apples, Heracles told him, "Hey, before you go, can you just hold up the sky for a second so I can get my footing right?" Surprisingly, it worked. The naive Atlas was left holding the skies while Heracles ran off with the apples.
How do you like them apples?
Okay, I know what you're thinking. But I thought Atlas had been turned into rock by Perseus using Medusa's head. Listen, you have to understand that these Greek myths were written and rewritten over many centuries by many different people, so there are multiple chronologies. In fact, each myth has several versions, and they often contradict each other, so you shouldn't take them too seriously. And now finally, we arrive at the last and hardest task, which was bringing to Mycenae none other than Cerberus, the three-headed dog with a serpent tail that guarded the entrance to Hades. Heracles had to be initiated in the Eleusinian Mysteries before he could enter the Underworld, but once he made it there, he freed Theseus, who had been stuck in Hades with his buddy Pirithous, while trying to kidnap Persephone. He also came across the spirit of Meleager, a famous hero who had killed the boar of Calydon. To get his help, Heracles promised Meleager that he would marry his sister, and with his guidance, he managed to make it through the Underworld, escaping from many dangers and eventually coming face to face with his uncle Hades, who allowed him to take the doggo as long as he promised to treat it well. After completing all of his labors, Heracles retired to live a peaceful life. He fulfilled his promise to marry Meleager's sister, Deianira, and together they had several children, the oldest of whom was Hylas. Sadly, Deianira ended up killing Heracles by accident when she gave him a shirt soaked in venomous Hydra's blood, which she thought was a love potion. Deianira was so upset by this that she killed herself, while Hylas and his siblings, known as the Heraclidae, tried to take over all of Greece, but their initial attempt failed and they had to retreat to the north. After many years, they returned, and this time they were successful. This is thought to be the Dorian invasion, which we mentioned in the video about ancient Greek history. This story begins with Athamas, son of Iolaus, a descendant of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who became king of Thebes. He had a wife, Nephele, and two children, Phrixus and Helle. Athamas later repudiated Nephele to marry Ino, who hated the children and conspired with the oracle to make the king sacrifice them. But just as Athamas was about to kill his children, Zeus intervened, sending a golden ram to save them. The kids flew away on the ram's back, but Helle fell off and drowned in a place which came to be known as the Hellespont. Phrixus made it to Colchis, where King Aeetes granted him asylum and offered him his daughter Chalciope in marriage. As a sign of gratitude, Phrixus sacrificed the ram and gave its golden fleece to the king, who hung it from an oak guarded by the fearsome dragon of Colchis. The second part of this story concerns Jason, whose uncle Peleus had killed his father and brothers to take over the throne of Iolcus in Thessaly. Jason had been saved by his mother and sent to be reared by the centaur Charon, who had tutored several other heroes. When he grew up, Jason returned to the city to claim the throne. Peleus didn't want to fight, so he told Jason that if he brought back the golden fleece of Colchis, he would step down peacefully. Jason then recruited the 50 best warriors throughout Greece, and together they embarked on the ship Argo, thus being known as Jason and the Argonauts. See what they did there? Among these brave adventurers were Heracles, Meleager, Orpheus, Asterius, and Argus, who had built the ship. Their journey was a long one and full of fascinating adventures. In Lemnos, they slept with smelly women who wouldn't let them leave. Heracles was abandoned on land after spending several days searching for his friend Hylas. They also fought Amycus, king of the Bebryces, in a boxing match.
You win!
Near Thrace, they rescued Phineus from the Harpies, monstrous winged women who stole all his food. And eventually, after many more capers, the Argonauts reached Colchis. Once there, King Aeetes promised to give Jason the golden fleece if he managed to complete some impossible tasks. Yoke the wild bulls he had gotten from the god Hephaestus and use them to sow the teeth of the dragon guarding the fleece. From these teeth would rise the Espartoi, warriors that he would have to defeat. Luckily for Jason, as often happens in these situations, the king's daughter, the sorceress Medea, fell in love with him and decided to help him. Thanks to her, Jason completed all the tasks and they run away with the golden fleece before King Aeetes could stop them. But the adventure wasn't quite over yet. On the way back, they avoided the clashing rocks and the songs of the sirens thanks to Orpheus, who played an even more beautiful melody on his lyre. They also overcame the sea monsters Scylla and Charybdis, and later, when they reached the island of Crete, King Minos made them fight against the giant Talos, an automaton created by Daedalus. Eventually they made it back to Iolcus, where King Pelias was not expecting them to return, but Medea used her magic to make the king's daughters kill him, and Jason finally regained his rightful throne. But after going through all that fuss to become king, he decided that he didn't really like Iolcus, and instead ended up retiring to Corinth with Medea. Some people are never happy. After the Golden Fleece adventure, Orpheus was living happily with his wife Eurydice, when one day Aristeus, son of the god Apollo, tried to force her. She managed to avoid him, but in escaping, she stepped on a venomous snake which bit her, and she died. Instead of grieving, Orpheus mustered his courage and descended into the underworld, seeking to rescue her. After putting Cerberus to sleep with his music, he presented his case to Hades, who allowed him to take Eurydice under one condition. He was not allowed to look at her until they were both safe under the sun's light. I suppose you can imagine what happened next. They managed to make it all the way to the edge of the underworld, but just as they were about to step outside, Orpheus couldn't help himself and turned round to look at his wife. She then passed out and was stuck in Hades forever. All the craziness related to the famous dynasty of the Atreidae began with another one of Zeus's sons, Tantalus, the rich king of Phrygia. He was very chummy with the gods and was even invited for dinner at Mount Olympus every now and then. But those friendships in high places went to his head, and the guy started to boast about it, reveal divine secrets, and even steal some godly nectars and other stuff. The last straw was when he decided to hold a banquet for the gods. You might think, nothing wrong with that, except that the main course was the boiled flesh of his own son Pelops. The gods did not see the funny side of this. They sent Tantalus to the underworld and resurrected Pelops, who later ended up ruling a city in the region and giving his name to the Peloponnesus. On his way to the throne, he married Hippodamia, princess of Olympia, whose hand he obtained by winning a chariot race, albeit with a little trickery. One of Pelops's children, Atreus, gave name to the dynasty of the Atreidae, or the House of Atreus. He and his twin brother Thyestes were exiled by their father for killing their half-brother Chrysippus. They went to Mycenae, where King Eurystheus welcomed them. But soon after, the king died fighting the Heracleidae, and the oracle said that the successor should be whoever carried the golden fleece, the symbol of royalty. That was Atreus, but his wife Arope secretly gave it to his brother Thyestes, who was her lover, and so Thyestes was crowned king. But then Zeus told the dejected Atreus that he would help him retake the throne. So then Atreus made a wager with Thyestes that if, on the next day, the sun set on the east, he would relinquish the throne. Naturally, Thyestes thought this was crazy and agreed to it, but then Zeus intervened, the sun changed direction for that day, and Atreus became king of Mycenae. Atreus then had 3 children who you might have heard of: Agamemnon, Menelaus, and Anaxibia. The trouble began when Atreus found out about the infidelity of his wife Arope with Thyestes. He got mad and took revenge by throwing her off a cliff. And then he killed all the children of his brother Thyestes, cooked them, and served them to him. When Atreus told Thyestes what he had eaten, with his belly full, he cursed all of Atreus' descendants. But Thyestes would eventually become king once again thanks to Aegisthus, a son he had had with his own daughter Pelopia, who killed his uncle Atreus, made his father king, and expelled the Atreidae. Agamemnon and Menelaus fled to the court of King Tyndareus of Sparta. According to the myth, this king had done a threesome with his wife, Leda, and Zeus in the shape of a swan. Leda birthed 2 eggs, out of which came 2 pairs of twins, Helen and Clytemnestra, and Castor and Pollux, also known as the Dioscuri. King Tyndareus lent his army to Agamemnon and Menelaus so they could topple their uncle. Agamemnon then became king of Mycena and married Clytemnestra, with whom he fathered Electra, Iphigenia, Orestes, and Chrysothemis, while his brother Menelaus married the other daughter of King Tyndareus, the beautiful Helen, and later became king of Sparta. And now we need to make a quick detour to introduce another part of the story. Thetis, one of the 50 Nereids, daughters of the primeval sea god Nereus, was given in a marriage of convenience to Peleus, king of Phthia. That wedding ended up causing plenty of misery, because they hadn't invited a certain individual who always caused trouble.
Eris, the goddess of discord.
True to her fame, Ares turned up anyway and brought one of the apples of the Hesperides, declaring it should be for the fairest of the goddesses. As you can imagine, this caused all kinds of mayhem, as Hera, Aphrodite, and Athena started fighting over the apple of discord. So Zeus tried to settle the dispute by asking Paris, a young prince of Troy, to name the fairest one. Talk about a hot potato. This judgment of Paris would eventually unleash the Trojan War, because Paris chose Aphrodite, goddess of beauty, love, and reproduction, and in reward she promised him the love of the most beautiful mortal woman. Unfortunately, that happened to be Helen, the wife of King Menelaus, as we will see in a minute. The misery didn't end with the wedding, because Peleus and Thetis had several babies, but they all kept dying. In despair, Thetis sought to make her last son, Achilles, invulnerable by dipping him into the river Styx, but since she was holding him by the ankle, that part didn't get wet and was his only weak point. Now that we have explained this, we can return to the main story of the Trojan War. According to Homer's epic poem, the Iliad, the Trojan War was caused by a love triangle, but if it did actually take place, it's far more likely that the reason was a mundane one: money. Specifically, Troy was strategically located on the Dardanelles, or the Hellespont as it was known in antiquity, and this allowed it control over the essential trade routes connecting with the Black Sea. But since we're talking about mythology, we'll stick to the legend, which is much more interesting anyway. Hector and Paris, sons of King Priam of Troy, had traveled to Sparta to negotiate a friendly treaty, but during their stay, Paris and Helen, wife of the Spartan king Menelaus, had fallen in love. It's not clear whether he kidnapped her or she decided to run away with him to Troy, but in any case, when Menelaus found out, he was furious. He went straight to see his brother Agamemnon, king of Mycena, and asked his help to kill the Trojans. The Atreidae gathered a massive fleet of over 1,000 boats and recruited a huge army with the best Greek, Lycaon, and Aeolian warriors. Among them was Achilles, who didn't really like King Agamemnon, but was considered to be the best warrior in the world. Together with Achilles was Patroclus, his comrade in arms, who also polished his sword, if you know what I mean. And there was also Odysseus, king of Ithaca, and better known by his Roman name Ulysses. More on him later. The massive army traveled to Troy and were unable to take the city straight away, so they laid siege to it. This lasted for 10 years and gave time for plenty of things to happen. Agamemnon kidnapped Chryseis, made her his concubine, but later had to free her when the gods intervened. Instead, he took Briseis from Achilles, which made him abandon the battle. Then Patroclus dressed up as Achilles and died fighting Hector, which made Achilles return and kill Hector in revenge. This in turn made Paris kill Achilles, shooting an arrow through his heel. But then Paris died at the hands of Philoctetes, son of the king of Thessaly, who had arrived late to the battle because he had been bitten by a snake. After all these deaths, but no changes in the course of the war, Odysseus came up with a sneaky plan to enter Troy. The Greeks built a massive wooden horse, left it outside the city walls, and made it appear as if they had abandoned the war and left. And it worked! The Trojans took the horse into the city, and that night the best Greek warriors came out of it, opened the gates for the rest of the army, which had hidden nearby, and finally conquered Troy. King Priam of Troy died in the battle, and King Menelaus of Sparta recovered his wife Helen. This was the end of the Trojan War. After the war, Agamemnon returned to his own kingdom, but the curse of the Atreidae was far from over. Agamemnon's wife Clytemnestra wanted revenge for the death of her daughter Iphigenia, who had been sacrificed by Agamemnon Agamemnon to the goddess Artemis so that his fleet could depart for Troy. Clytemnestra and her lover Aegisthus killed Agamemnon while he was sleeping, and their remaining children, Electra and Orestes, fled the court in fear and despair. Orestes went to stay with his uncle Strophius, king of Phocis. Years later, the siblings met again in front of Agamemnon's tomb and vowed to seek revenge. They killed Aegisthus and their own mother Clytemnestra, but then the Erinyes, the deities who punished parricide, chased Orestes and drove him mad. Both siblings were judged in Athens, but the god Apollo intervened to win the trial and free Orestes. There were other heroes who went through great adventures on their way back from the Trojan War. One of these stories is told in the Aeneid, the account of Aeneas, who reached the Italian peninsula. According to Roman tradition, his descendants were Romulus and Remus, who founded the city of Rome. Another famous story is Homer's Odyssey, which tells the tale of Odysseus, king of Ithaca, who took 2 years to return home. During his journey, he had to deal with the Cyclops Polyphemus, fight the Laestrygonians, a tribe of man-eating giants, cross Hades, and avoid the songs of the Sirens, who in Greek mythology were half human and half bird. In the island of Ogygia, Odysseus and his crew were captured by the sea nymph Calypso, who wanted to marry him. After escaping, Odysseus finally managed to return to Ithaca, only to find a line of suitors pestering his wife Penelope, since everyone presumed him dead. Instead of sending them away, Odysseus and his son Telemachus just killed them all. The Trojan War marked the end of the Age of Heroes and Greek mythology. All the demigods eventually passed away, and their souls went to the legendary Fortunate Isles, while we, the humans of the Age of Iron, inherited the Earth. At this point in history, the Dorians, who considered themselves the descendants of Heracles, moved south and took over all of Greece until the Dark Age of 1200 BC, when writing was lost, so no records remain of the next 500 years. History resumed in the 8th century BC, thanks to authors like Homer and Hesiod, who left us these fantastic adventures, the blockbusters of the ancient age. There are numerous myths about ancient cities and even entire civilizations which were very powerful in the past and yet somehow managed to disappear without a trace. How is that possible? What is the real story behind this? Is there some basis of truth, or are they just lies and fancies? In this third and final episode of our series on Greek mythology, we are going to talk about the most famous of all lost civilizations, Atlantis. The origin of the Atlantean legend is believed to be a visit by the famous Greek legislator Solon to Egypt, where some decrepit priests told him about an ancient tale regarding his own nation. When he returned to Athens, Solon recounted this story to several other figures, who then spread it further. One of these was Dropides, who told it to his grandson Critias. Later, around the year 360 BC, that same Critias, the future tyrant of Athens, a Syracusan general named Hermocrates, and 3 famous philosophers, Timaeus, Socrates, and Plato, got together to drink some wine, eat some olives, and philosophize. Well, actually, that meeting only took place in Plato's head, since the other characters had been dead for over 40 years.
I see dead people.
But the key point is that this conversation, perhaps fictional or perhaps remembered, is when the topic of Atlantis first came up. It was collected in 2 of Plato's famous dialogues, Timaeus and Critias. According to these writings, in the words of Critias, as told to him by his grandfather, Atlantis had been a great military power, which had been at its peak 9,000 years earlier. They had abundant natural resources, like all kinds of animals, especially bulls and elephants, and also unlimited timber and the famous orichalcum, or mountain copper, which was thought to be a super shiny natural alloy of copper and gold. The location of Atlantis is not indicated precisely, but the dialogue places it beyond the Pillars of Hercules, or in other words, the Straits of Gibraltar, and it is described as being larger than Libya and Asia combined. Bear in mind, though, that for the ancient Greeks, Asia reached up to India, since that was all they knew. And perhaps when they said Asia, they were referring just to the Anatolian Peninsula. But in any case, it seems that the lost continent was enormous. The myth says that the first inhabitants of Atlantis were Evenor, born from the earth, and his wife Leucippe. The sea god Poseidon fell in love with their daughter Cleito, and together they produced the lineage of Atlantean kings. They had 10 children in total, and so the island was divided into 10 kingdoms. The eldest of those children was Atlas, who lent his name to the land of Atlantis and also to the surrounding Atlantic Ocean. Just a quick but important note here, this Atlas is not the same as the Titan Atlas, who was condemned to hold up the skies by Zeus and for whom the Atlas Range in Morocco is named, as we saw in previous episodes. Atlas had a twin brother, Gadirus, who gave his name to the settlement of Gadira, which is the modern-day city of Cádiz in Spain. Back in Atlantis, Poseidon created several concentric canals to protect the land, and the 10 royal siblings raised magnificent temples in honor of their mother Cleito and their father Poseidon. They also built a stele of Orichalcum where they inscribed all the country's laws, sort of an Atlantean version of the Code of Hammurabi. The Atlanteans were a great civilization, but as the centuries went by, their kings became increasingly arrogant and sought to expand their domains. They reached Europe up to Etruria and Africa up to Libya. Then they tried to conquer Egypt and Greece, but at that point the Athenians beat them back. This is one of the strange parts of the story, since this supposedly happened during an age well before the Greeks existed, let alone Athens. Anyway, the legend then says that after the military defeat, a massive but undetermined catastrophe, some believe a flood, wiped out the entire continent and civilization of Atlantis overnight. Boom! At this point, Critias' story is interrupted and the narrative is left unfinished. It seems that Plato had intended to write a third dialogue called Hermocrates, whose turn it was to intervene after Critias, but he never got round to it. Returning to our story, after the Athenian victory against the Atlanteans, the legend was gradually forgotten by the Greeks for several millennia, until it eventually reached Solon. This story had always been considered a myth, but during the Renaissance, with the renewed interest in Greek classics, there started to appear multiple theories which sought to uncover the elements of truth hidden in the legend. Some even believe that the real reason why Columbus wanted to sail across the Atlantic was to find the remains of this once great civilization. Eventually, the tale reached ordinary citizens, exploded in popularity, and became firmly ingrained in the collective imagination, where it has remained ever since. For example, in 1869, Atlantis appeared in Jules Verne's super famous novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Seas. In 1883, American writer and politician Ignatius Donnelly published The Antediluvian World, where he argued that Atlantis had indeed existed and its remains were the Azores Islands. According to his theory, this civilization had been the origin of all human cultures. The Atlanteans were supposed to be a very advanced primeval race who disseminated their knowledge to the east and the west, from Egypt to South America, and that would be the reason why humans on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean built pyramids and their cultures featured similar symbols, like snakes, which were worshipped and feared in most early human religions.
I hate snakes!
All in all, while Donnelly significantly contributed to the popularity of the myth, he is also the reason why there is so much kooky, crackpot rubbish around it nowadays. More recently, in 1999, author Jim Allen said that the remains of Atlantis lie in Bolivia, specifically in the Bolivian Altiplano, in a rectangular flatland next to Lake Poopó and Pampa Auyagas. And just to make things a little bit more interesting and mysterious, it turns out that in the ancient Aztec language, Atl means water, while in Inca, Antis means copper. It almost seems too much for this to be a simple coincidence.
Coincidence? I think not!
Then again, that region is full of mysteries, like strange ruins in Lake Titicaca and the city of Tiahuanaco, which we may talk some more about in future videos. Even the Nazis believe in Atlantis. They traveled all over the world in search of the origins of the Aryan race, which they linked with the Atlanteans in order to justify their superiority over the rest of Europe. One of the places they searched was Tibet, which was a relatively unknown region at the time, since it was isolated up in the Himalayas. According to the Nazi narrative, that is where the survivors of Atlantis had taken refuge, shunning all contact with the rest of the world for several millennia. In addition, Hitler's party and the Fool Society took inspiration from the symbols of Hinduism, and they also believed in Hyperborea, the mythical land located in the north of Europe, which we mentioned in previous episodes. The Nazis thought that the Hyperboreans had been the primeval inhabitants of the world, and that when their civilization collapsed, they created a subterranean kingdom known as Agartha, supposedly located under the Himalayas and the Gobi Desert, whose capital was the mythical city of Shambhala.
Cobra Law!
No, Shambhala. Another idea that came up during the 19th century contemplated the possibility that the Atlantean civilization may have been the same as the mysterious Tartessians located in southern Spain. This theory says that their cities were buried by a huge tsunami. In 2005, researchers investigated the area with ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging, and they reported some initial and promising findings, including buried structures which appeared to be man-made. But don't get your hopes up, because that region is a protected reserve, the beautiful natural park of Doñana, so archaeological digs are completely out of the question, especially since it's not 100% clear what the heck is down there. It could well be just a funky rock formation. Another element that comes up in the connection between Atlantis and the Tartessians is a circular design found in the ruins of Canchorroano in the neighboring region of Badajoz. Some connect those concentric circles with the reported architecture of Atlantis, but then again, it could also be just a shield or something like that. In fact, it's not even clear whether this site is truly a Tartessian town, since there is precious little knowledge about that culture. What we do know is that the Phoenicians taught them metallurgy, and they later became very famous for it, and that could be a connection with the legendary Orichalcum. But their trail completely disappeared around the year 500 BC, following the reign of their supposed last king, Arganthonius, and nobody really knows what happened to the Tartessians. Some say that they were conquered and absorbed by the Carthaginians, while others believe that their civilization was destroyed by a tsunami which buried most of their settlements. As you can see, when it comes to Atlantis, there are plenty of theories, but no certainties. Many scholars think that Plato made up the entire Atlantean myth, or else took different elements of other much older myths in order to create an allegory. But an allegory of what? Well, at that time, Athens was embroiled in the Peloponnesian War, the famous battle royale with all the Greeks killing each other. It could be that Plato sought to promote unity with this mythical tale of ancient Greeks joining forces to defeat a common, super-powerful enemy like Atlantis. Or perhaps it was the complete opposite, and maybe he was criticizing the imperialism that the Delian League was pushing around the Aegean Sea. And then another theory says that Plato just used the mythical Atlantis as an ideal model of a perfect, wise and fair society, since this was something that he was obsessed with, as we can read in his famous work, Republic.
I welcome you all to Cloud Cuckoo Land!
In terms of solid evidence, as we explained in an episode of the Spanish Channel, in 1900, archaeologist Arthur Evans discovered the Palace of Knossos, and that enabled us to learn about the Minoan or Cretan civilization. Years later, many people began to draw up theories identifying this pre-Hellenic culture as the origin of the Atlantean myth. Since it was an island, it had luxurious palaces, and their society was considerably advanced. And they also had many bulls, although no elephants that we know of. The last piece of the puzzle was the eruption of a volcano in the neighboring island of Thera, sometime between 1600 and 1400 BC. Although it didn't completely wipe out the Minoan civilization, it definitely left it severely damaged. This may have been the terrible catastrophe that, according to the myth, sent Atlantis to the bottom of the sea.
Under the sea.
As we said at the beginning, Atlantis is not the only case of a lost civilization. Towards the end of the 19th century, there emerged the theory of Lemuria, a lost continent in the Indian Ocean, which sought to explain why there were fossils of lemurs and other very similar animals in both Madagascar and India, on opposite sides of the Indian Ocean. And we also have the lost continent of Mu, which is pretty much the same story, but this time in the Pacific Ocean. An officer in the British Army in India, James Churchward, posited the existence of this lost continent of Mu after allegedly deciphering, with the help of Hindu priests, some ancient tales of a mother civilization which had fallen into disgrace. With this, he sought to explain artistic, religious and linguistic similarities between the civilizations of the Indus Valley, Egypt, Mesopotamia, pre-Columbian cultures in South America and Easter Island. The interesting thing is that the inhabitants of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui as they call it, also have a story about a mythical island called Haiva, which they originally came from, and in fact, so do the Polynesians, although they call it Hawaiki. But unfortunately for myth lovers, 60 years later, all of these theories about giant islands and lost continents in the middle of the ocean were completely ruled out by the confirmation of plate tectonics. Nevertheless, some people still view things like the mysterious submarine structures of Yonaguni in Japan as evidence that there was once a civilization that we modern humans know nothing about. In all likelihood, Atlantis is just a myth, a fictional story, but it is true that very often such tales have some kernel of truth. Just look at the example of Heinrich Schliemann, an enthusiast of Greek mythology who got it into his head that he would find the mythical city of Troy or eat his shoe. Although he was mocked by everyone, he set out to meticulously follow the tale of the Iliad and eventually ended up discovering the buried ruins of the city in 1871. Nowadays, Troy is no longer a myth. It has become a part of history. Will Atlantis be next? And the rest is history. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave us a big like. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.